Status used to be a wall, a physical, institutional, legally reinforced wall that kept the world at a distance and guaranteed a level of protection that most people can barely imagine: private woodland, specialized security teams. Professional operatives whose entire purpose was to ensure that whatever happened to other people, it did not happen to you. The buffer of privilege, the architecture of untouchability, that wall is gone. And what has replaced it? A 5-bedroom farmhouse, a basic mobile security unit parked on the property, standard fencing, a few trees between Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and the public road, is not just a reduction in comfort. It is a statement about what the institution has decided he is worth, about where the money is going and where it is not. About the specific and irreversible shift in his relationship with the crown that has produced, in the most physical and most visible terms, the world he now inhabits. And into that world last January, a man named Alex Jenkinson approached his vehicle, masked, armed. Covering 50 yards of gravel in a desperate sprint, the scramble to safety was ungraceful. The protection that remained managed to get him to his car. He was physically unharmed. But the belief held apparently with remarkable persistence through everything else that has happened, that his name alone acts as a shield, that the royal blood is itself a protection, that somehow the rules of threat and vulnerability that apply to ordinary people do not apply to him, that belief has now vanished too. The world has changed. And the question this raises for Andrew, for the king, for the institution, for everyone watching, is what comes next when the walls are finally down. Today we are going to go through all of it. The security incident and what it revealed, the financial severance and what it means, the Royal Lodge dossier and the desperate legal argument it represented, the arrest and the collapse it marked. The reports of threats made and the moment the negotiation between two brothers became something uglier, and the central question that hangs over everything: does a king owe his brother protection when that brother has become a threat to the crown's survival? Let's get into it. Let's start with the security situation, because it is the most immediate and most visceral expression of where things stand. The king made the decision to withdraw private funding for the specialized security team that once patrolled Andrew's grounds. This was not a public announcement, not a press release or an official statement. It was a private financial decision, the closing of an account, the ending of a funding stream that had been sustaining a level of security appropriate for a working senior member of the royal family. Andrew is not a working senior member of the royal family. He has not been for several years. The titles are gone, the official duties are gone. The institutional standing that justified the level of security he was receiving has been formally and completely removed, and so the funding for that security was removed too, replaced with what is described in the reporting as a basic mobile unit, a functional solution. A practical arrangement that provides some level of protection without the cost or the institutional endorsement of the specialist team that previously patrolled the grounds. The cost of the private security detail that Andrew would need to make his situation genuinely safe is reported at £2 million per year. His annual allowance from the king was £1 million, and that allowance has also been cut. So even setting aside every other dimension of his situation, the pure arithmetic is stark. The security he needs costs more than the total annual support he was receiving. Without the royal stipend, there is no mechanism through which that security can be funded. He is living within reach of the public road, separated by standard fencing and a few trees from the passing world. The vast buffer of private woodland that Royal Lodge provided, the 98 acres that guaranteed total seclusion, that kept the curious and the hostile at a physical distance that made threats manageable, is gone. Marsh Farm does not offer that. Marsh Farm is a farmhouse. Whatever reinforcements have been added to its security infrastructure, the heavy gates, the floodlights, the no-fly zone for drones, it is not the same category of protection. And then Wolferton, the village, the silence, and the man with the mask. Let's go through the Wolferton incident carefully, because it is the moment when the theoretical became actual, when the question of whether reduced security creates genuine risk received a concrete and frightening answer. Alex Jenkinson approached the vehicle. Masked, armed, 50 yards of gravel covered in a sprint, the protection that remained, the diminished but still present detail, managed the situation. Andrew reached his car. The physical threat was resolved without physical harm, but the incident required an 11-hour police operation that, according to the reporting, effectively paralyzed the local area. Norfolk Police, rural police, with the resource constraints that characterize rural policing, had to redirect significant capacity to manage a crisis for a man who no longer sits within official royal protection protocols. A man whose status as a private individual means that the institutional mechanisms for managing security threats to senior royals do not straightforwardly apply to him. This is the specific trap that the king is in regarding his brother's security. If the crown provides full specialist protection, it makes a statement that Andrew retains a special status, that royal blood commands resources regardless of what the individual has done or what title they hold. That statement runs counter to everything the institution has been communicating through its other decisions. The stripped titles, the removed allowance, the eviction from Royal Lodge, all of those decisions said he is not receiving special treatment. Restoring full security says, actually he is. If the Crown provides minimal security as it currently is, the Wolferton incident demonstrates the real and immediate consequences. A vulnerable individual in a public-facing location, inadequately protected, targeted by a masked attacker. The institution cannot allow that situation to escalate to the point where someone is hurt or killed. The reputational and human consequences of Andrew being seriously harmed while inadequately protected would be severe. The Crown is trapped. Providing full protection invites public anger. Providing nothing risks a tragedy the monarchy might not survive. The middle path, the basic mobile unit, the makeshift arrangement, is what the institution has settled on, and the Wolferton incident has demonstrated that the middle path is not comfortable. Now let's talk about the Royal Lodge dossier, because this is one of the most revealing details in the entire story of Andrew's relationship with his new reduced circumstances. In January, at a private gathering attended by family members, Andrew presented a thick dossier, a paper trail, legal documents, the evidence, as he framed it, of his right to remain at Royal Lodge. His argument: he signed a 75-year lease on the property decades ago. He invested £7.5 million of his own capital into the estate. A signed contract should be a shield even a king cannot pierce. The image this creates is extraordinary. A man who was once HRH the Duke of York, a man who held military titles, official positions, and the full institutional backing of the British monarchy, sitting in front of his family with a pile of legal folders, arguing his right to keep his home with the desperate precision of a tenant facing eviction, because that is, in the most fundamental sense, what he is. A tenant in a property that the institution controls, a resident whose continued occupation depends not on his right as a member of the royal family, but on the specific legal terms of an arrangement that the institution has decided it no longer wishes to sustain. The dossier was his attempt to find a legal argument. To locate in the fine print of a lease signed decades ago something that would force the institution to honor the arrangement regardless of everything else that has happened, to use the law where the institution has withdrawn its willingness. The king's response was the quiet finality of a man closing the accounts, the £1 million annual allowance gone. The private security funding gone, the institutional support that made Royal Lodge viable withdrawn, not as a public announcement, as a private series of financial decisions that produced, cumulatively, the situation where Andrew's continued occupation of a 30-room mansion is economically impossible. You cannot defend a 30-room mansion without the resources to pay for it, and the resources have been removed. Let me talk about the specific financial arithmetic, because it tells the story more clearly than any analysis can. The lease, £7.5 million invested in the property, a 75-year agreement signed when his position seemed invulnerable, a document that he clearly believed would protect his occupation indefinitely. The annual allowance, £1 million, now cut, gone. The funding stream that sustained the lifestyle, the staff, the basic operating costs of the household, removed. The security, £2 million per year for the specialist detail that his situation genuinely requires. Without the allowance, without a working royal income, without any identified source of the funds required to pay for it, unavailable. The staff at Royal Lodge, 28 people, reduced already to 3, the domestic infrastructure that made his life function, gone in the practical sense, even if not entirely in the formal one. Royal Lodge itself, a 30-room property that requires maintenance, staff, heating, security, operational costs that £1 million annual allowance barely covered and that no current funding stream can support. The arithmetic is ruthless and it is complete. He cannot maintain the life. The institution knows he cannot maintain the life. The removal of the funding was the mechanism by which the institution made the unmaintainable explicit. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the practical application of a decision that had already been made at the level of principle. He is not a working royal. Working royals receive institutional support. Private individuals do not. The dossier of legal documents he brought to the family gathering was, in that context, a form of denial. An attempt to use legal technicality to resist a decision that had already been made at a level above where legal technicality applies. Kings cannot be sued by their brothers for withdrawing discretionary allowances. The institution's support for Andrew was never contractual, it was conditional. And the conditions have changed. Now let's talk about the arrest, because February the 19th, 2026 was not simply another development in a long story, it was, as the reporting describes it, a final reckoning. His 66th birthday, the day that marks statutory retirement in Britain, the day that most people of that age turn toward a quieter chapter, for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor it arrived with police officers at his door. Arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office, 11 hours in custody, released under investigation, the first senior member of the British royal family to be arrested in 400 years. What led to this specific moment? The US Department of Justice had released 3,000 pages of evidence the month before, every date, every name. Every piece of private correspondence and private arrangement that Epstein's operation had generated laid bare in government documents, catalogued by a foreign government, specific, detailed. Impossible to dismiss or contextualize away, and there was the death of Virginia Gioffa in 2025. Her passing did not bring the closure that the legal settlement of 2022 had perhaps suggested was approaching. Instead, it produced something different. A permanent, unanswerable silence. The person at the center of the most specific and most damaging of the allegations was gone, and with her departure, Andrew did not become less of a subject of public scrutiny, he became more isolated in his position. More singularly, the focus of the resentment that the entire Epstein scandal had generated. The Crown could survive many storms. As the reporting puts it, it cannot stay tethered to someone the world has stopped trying to forgive. The arrest was the moment where the full weight of everything landed simultaneously. The documents, the investigation, the legal jeopardy, the physical fact of police officers and custody and 11 hours as detainee A. The gap between who he once was HRH naval officer, the Queen's handsome son, and who he is now, a private individual in a 5-bedroom farmhouse without titles, without allowance, without the specialist security he cannot pay for, under investigation for serious misconduct, that gap is not a fall from grace, it is the complete dismantling of a life. Now we need to talk about the threats. Because this is the most sensitive and the most explosive dimension of the story, and it deserves the most careful treatment, the reporting describes a moment when the negotiation between the two brothers over security, over housing, over what the king owes his brother in terms of ongoing support became something uglier, something that crossed a line. It is described as a desperate attempt to leverage the past, a suggestion that certain family secrets would remain buried only if the king continued to pay the legal bills, a gamble born, in the reporting's phrase, of a cornered mind. I want to be precise about what is being alleged here. Because this is described in the reporting as a report, as something that is circulating in accounts of the situation, and not as an established, confirmed, legally verified fact, the reporting frames it as a suggestion, a hint, a desperation move, not a confirmed ultimatum with documented evidence, but even as an allegation, even as something that is being discussed as a possibility rather than a certainty, it is significant. Because it describes a dynamic between the brothers that has moved from difficult to something more serious, from a family managing the consequences of one member's catastrophic choices to a situation where leverage is apparently being deployed. And the king's response, if the reporting is accurate, was characteristic. He is a father. But he is primarily a sovereign. He realized the cost of protecting his brother had become the integrity of the monarchy itself. He closed the folders. He moved past the negotiation. The secrets in this framing no longer have the value that the leverage assumed they had, because the king has decided that the institution's survival is more important than the management of whatever private information Andrew believes he holds. And that decision, to choose the institution over the individual, the monarchy over the brother, is the moment that the exile becomes not a temporary arrangement but a permanent condition. Let me think about what this moment means for Harry. Because the reporting raises it, and it is a genuinely interesting dimension of the story, Harry's legal team has been engaged in a prolonged dispute about the level of security provided to him when he is in the UK. The argument has centered on the principle that protection should be based on threat assessment, on the actual specific risk to an individual, rather than solely on the holder's current official status within the royal hierarchy. The Wolferton incident, a masked, armed individual approaching Andrew's vehicle, provides the most concrete possible evidence that individuals connected to the royal family face genuine security threats regardless of their official status. Regardless of whether they hold titles, regardless of whether they are currently in the institutional favor that attracts institutional security, if a man without any titles, stripped of all royal designations, living in a farmhouse in Norfolk can be targeted by a masked attacker, the argument that security should follow risk rather than status becomes considerably more powerful. Harry's legal team is, as the reporting notes, probably watching these events with significant interest. This is one of the unintended consequences of the king's approach to Andrew's security. The decision to reduce the protection to the level of a basic mobile unit, while institutionally and financially coherent within the logic of the slimmed-down monarchy, creates a precedent and an evidence base that Harry's team can use to argue for their own position. The institution, by treating Andrew as a private individual without the protection that private individuals cannot realistically afford, has implicitly acknowledged that the threat to royal-adjacent individuals is real and continues regardless of official status. That acknowledgement cuts both ways. And the legal team in California has presumably noted it. Let me talk about the calls from Anne and Edward, because they are one of the most humanly affecting details in this entire story. The phone rings in the stillness of the afternoon. Anne, Edward, not calls full of warmth and laughter and the easy familiarity of siblings in comfortable relationship, formal checks on a brother's pulse. The dry exchange of facts, concern expressed in the language of people who love each other but who are managing a situation that has made the ordinary expressions of that love complicated, even in a family strained to its limits by scandal and by institutional decisions that have separated its members from each other in visible and irreversible ways. Brother remains brother. The calls happen. The concern is real, but a concerned phone call cannot replace a professional security perimeter. And the specific warmth that Anne and Edward's calls represent, the familial connection that persists through everything, does not resolve the practical reality of a man living behind standard fencing with a basic mobile security unit, 2 miles from a king who does not visit in person. There is something in that specific combination, the warmth of the calls, the coldness of the physical reality, that captures the full complexity of where the family is. They have not stopped being a family, the connections are real, but the institutional decisions that have shaped the physical landscape of Andrew's life have created a distance between the personal warmth and the practical situation that cannot simply be willed away by familial concern. Charles has chosen the institution over the individual. That does not mean he does not feel the personal dimension of what that choice costs, but sovereignty requires a different calculation than brotherhood, and in the specific moment the institution is in managing the most serious crisis of Andrew's situation, protecting the future of the monarchy, navigating the legal proceedings and the document releases and the public pressure, the sovereign's calculation has to take precedence over the brother's instinct. Now let me talk about Andrew's own response to the Wolferton incident. Because it reveals something important about how he is understanding his situation and what he believes is possible, he sees opportunity in the chaos. A masked man's sprint across 50 yards of gravel is, in Andrew's framing, not simply a frightening incident, it is a legal asset. Evidence, proof that the king's decision to reduce his security was a mistake, that the judgment made at the institutional level that his reduced status justifies reduced protection, has been demonstrated by events to have been wrong. He wants his state-funded shield back. He argues that royal blood should never be left defenseless, that the incident at Wolferton demonstrates concretely and unarguably that the threat is real and that the protection currently provided is insufficient to manage it. This argument is not without its logic. If the purpose of security is to keep the individual safe, and the individual has been demonstrably unsafe, then the security is demonstrably insufficient. The incident proves the point, but the king is not making a decision based solely on whether Andrew is safe. He is making a decision based on what the institution can sustain, what the public can accept, and what the precedent of providing full specialist protection to a man who has been stripped of all official designation would communicate about the nature of royal privilege. To restore full security would be a public admission that some people are still above the rules. That royal blood confers protection that transcends official status, that the institutional decisions about titles and roles and formal position are in some sense performative because the real protection continues regardless. The king has decided that the era of the unconditional royal safety net is over, that the message the institution needs to send through its decisions about housing, allowances, and security is consistent. You are a private individual. Private individuals pay for their own security. If you cannot afford it, that is a consequence of the choices that led you here. That is not cruelty. It is realism, but it is a realism that produces the Wolferton incident as its natural and predictable consequence. Let me think about the paradox that Marsh Farm represents, because the reporting captures it with precision that is worth examining. Andrew has been cast out, formally, publicly, through the specific institutional decisions that have stripped his titles and his allowance and his working royal status. He is not inside the institution, he is explicitly outside it. And yet the security infrastructure at Marsh Farm, the heavy reinforced gates, the high-intensity floodlights monitoring the grounds, the permanent no-fly zone for drones, is more physically restrictive than almost anything he lived under during his years of full institutional backing. Not more comfortable, but more restrictive, more confined. More controlled in the physical sense of movement and visibility, he is living in a paradox, cast out, but more enclosed than ever by the measures that have to exist to keep him safe. The freedom that private citizenship might seem to imply, the ability to move through the world without the constant management and constraint of royal protocol, is not available to him, because the threat that attaches to his name and his history does not disappear with the title. The vulnerability is real, the confinement that managing that vulnerability requires is real. And the confinement is the price of a level of safety that the institution is no longer willing to fully fund. He is not free, he is not protected, he is in the specific purgatory that exists between the two. Restricted enough to be uncomfortable, exposed enough to be vulnerable, in a small world that is getting smaller, let's address the central question of the story directly. Because it is the question that the reporting poses and that deserves a serious answer, does the king owe his brother protection? The instinctive human answer is yes, of course. Brothers owe each other the basics of safety and well-being. Family connections carry obligations that transcend the institutional calculations of even a monarchy. The man in the farmhouse is still the king's brother. He was still there when they grew up. Still shares blood and history, and whatever form the private human relationship between them takes when the cameras are not present, the institutional answer is more complicated. The king is not primarily a brother, he is a sovereign. The institution he leads has responsibilities to the public that fund it, to the people who trust it, to the future generations who will inherit it. Using public resources to fund comprehensive specialist security for a man who has been stripped of all official designation, who is not a working royal, who does not carry out official duties, who is not performing any function that justifies public expenditure, is a decision that can be challenged, questioned, and used as evidence that the institution protects its own regardless of what they have done. The practical answer tries to navigate between the two: a basic mobile unit. Some level of protection, not nothing, not the full specialist detail, something that acknowledges the reality of the threat without fully restoring the privileges that the institutional decisions have withdrawn. The Wolferton incident has demonstrated that the practical answer is not comfortable, that the space between nothing and full protection is a space where a masked man with a weapon can cover 50 yards of gravel and get close enough to make the point that the current arrangements are insufficient, and so the king is left with the impossible calculation. Full protection invites public anger and institutional contradiction. Nothing invites tragedy. The middle path invites incidents like Wolferton. There is no clean answer. There is no version of this situation that resolves neatly into a position that is simultaneously fair to Andrew, credible to the public, consistent with the institutional decisions that have already been made, and practically sufficient to keep him safe. Let me talk about what this means for the institution's future, because the Andrew situation is not simply about one man and one family, it has implications that extend considerably further, the Harry situation. Already discussed, the precedent being set about security for royal-adjacent individuals without current official status will be examined carefully by legal teams who have an interest in a different conclusion from the one the current approach implies: the broader message about royal accountability. Every decision the king makes about Andrew is read, by the public and by the media and by those who study the institution, as a statement about whether the monarchy is genuinely committed to the principle that no individual is above accountability regardless of their birth. Providing full security undermines that message. Providing insufficient security creates incidents that embarrass the institution. The navigation between those two outcomes is genuinely difficult, the question of what happens when the legal proceedings conclude. Right now, the situation is suspended in the specific uncertainty of an ongoing investigation. When that investigation reaches a conclusion, when charges are either brought or not brought, when the legal process reaches some form of resolution, the question of what Andrew's permanent situation looks like will have to be answered more completely than the current arrangement permits. If charges are brought and a conviction follows, the question of security for a convicted member of the royal family, even a former member, even someone who holds no titles, is one that nobody has previously had to answer. If the investigation concludes without charges, the question of whether some form of rehabilitation or at least normalization of his situation becomes possible is one that will have to be addressed. The current arrangement, the farmhouse, the basic mobile unit, the cut allowance, the no visits from the king, is a holding pattern, a managed suspension of the more difficult questions. It maintains distance without resolving anything. It communicates the institution's position without finalizing it. That holding pattern cannot be maintained indefinitely. At some point, the questions that it is deferring will have to be answered. Let me close by thinking about what this story reveals about the specific nature of power and protection in the modern monarchy. Status used to be a wall. That is how the reporting opens, and it is the right observation to return to at the close. The wall was real. The protection it provided was real. The buffer of privilege, the private woodland, the specialist security, the institutional machinery that managed threats before they could become incidents, was a genuine and valuable form of insulation from a world that is not always safe. The removal of that wall has exposed something that the wall was always obscuring, that the protection was never really about Andrew himself, it was about the institution, about the value of a functioning, safe, publicly visible member of the royal family. About protecting an asset of the crown, when Andrew ceased to be an asset and became a liability, when the institutional calculation shifted from he is worth protecting to he is a risk that protecting creates, the wall came down, not because the institution stopped caring about his safety as a human matter, but because the institutional logic that had built and maintained the wall no longer applied. And Andrew is left in the specific reality that the removal of the wall creates, exposed, vulnerable, in a world where the status that was his birthright has been redefined as a private matter rather than a public one. Where the protection that followed the status has followed the status into history, he is looking at the distance between his front door and his car, and the distance is considerably longer than it used to be. The king has chosen the institution over the individual. That choice is, in institutional terms, correct. In human terms, it is painful, and in practical terms, as Wolferton demonstrated, it creates consequences that do not resolve themselves cleanly. The walls are down. The questions are not answered, and the exile that was temporary has become, as the gates of Marsh Farm close behind each day, something that looks increasingly permanent. That is everything for today, one of the most consequential chapters in the Andrew story, and one that raises questions that go well beyond the personal circumstances of one man. If you are not yet subscribed, please do it now. It is completely free, and this story has further to go than anyone can currently predict. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Does the king owe his brother protection? Do you think the institutional decisions about Andrew's security have been handled correctly, or do you think the Wolferton incident reveals that the current approach is insufficient? And who do you think Charles should ultimately prioritize, the institution or his brother? Thank you for watching.